In 1982, a Syracuse man named Anthony Broadwater was convicted and sentenced to prison for assaulting a Syracuse University student. The entire time during the trial, he maintained his innocence. He said, "I didn't do it." But he was convicted on the strength of the victim's testimony, who identified him, and also forensic evidence that linked him to the scene. And so he was convicted and sentenced to prison, and nobody believed him when he said that I'm innocent. After 8 years in prison, he had the opportunity to go up before the parole board and maybe get out early. But the parole board wanted him, as a contingency for his early release from prison, to admit his guilt. And they felt that he had not yet admitted his guilt for the crime. And he wouldn't admit his guilt. He said, "No, I'm innocent, I didn't do it." And so his parole was revoked. 2 years later, he went before the parole board again after 10 years in prison. And he said again, "I didn't do it." And so they revoked his parole. And so he just eventually rejected, in the future, requests from the parole board to be seen because he was unwilling to say that he was guilty. Finally, after just over 16 years in prison, he was finally released. When he was released, he was immediately put on the New York State sex offenders list, so he moved in with his cousin and lived an isolated life working odd jobs. About a year into this, his cousin met a woman named Elizabeth, who his cousin thought would be a good fit for Anthony. And so he wanted to introduce them and set them up. And Anthony wanted to meet this woman, but he obviously had no idea what to do with his criminal record, his criminal history, his conviction, the fact that he was a registered sex offender, and his own side of the story, where he maintained his innocence. He didn't know what to do with any of that. And so he wasn't sure what to do with respect to meeting this woman. Finally, what he decided to do was to just meet her and give her all the available information about his case, tell her his side of the story, and then let her decide if she wanted to be in a relationship with him anymore. This story was relayed in an article in the New Yorker magazine just under a year ago, and this is what happened next. On their first night together, he told her that he wanted to be in a relationship with her, but that she had to read his trial documents first. He slept on the couch while she spent the night in his bedroom with the transcripts. In the morning, she came into the living room where he was sleeping and said, crying, that she believed him. Elizabeth believed his story when nobody else did. And Elizabeth's faith was vindicated. Over a decade later, Anthony received a call from a man who said that people had been looking at his case and that it looked particularly weak. The lineup that had identified him was bad. There was an unhelpful racial dynamic at play as a black man who had been accused by a white woman, and the forensic science that had linked him to the scene just a few years earlier, the FBI had thrown it out as bad junk science. And so this man wanted to help Anthony appeal his conviction, and they did. They appealed his conviction, and they won. And so in 2021, after 40 years of maintaining his innocence, Anthony Broadwater's case was completely overturned by the state of New York. We've got a photo here of Anthony and Elizabeth, who believed him when nobody else did. While Anthony acknowledges that he can't get the time back that was taken from him, there have been a few graces since the overturn of his conviction that have come his way, including recently receiving a $5.5 million wrongful conviction settlement from the state of New York. But according to Anthony, one such grace is that he can now fully confide in his therapist, because now that he's been publicly exonerated, he no longer has to worry about whether or not people believe his story. Why did Elizabeth believe Anthony's story? When nobody else did, when nobody else believed him after maintaining his innocence for 40 years, why? When the state didn't believe him, when the state's best evidence didn't believe him, where did she get the power to believe him? And as a result, to be right about the truth of the situation before anyone else was. We don't view believing very highly in the modern world. Belief is met with skepticism. We don't believe things today. We don't want to believe things. We want to know things. We don't believe things today. We know things. We want to know things for sure through science and empirical methodologies. We don't want to believe things anymore. We want to know things for sure and for fact. And not only do we not want to have beliefs about anything, but maybe beliefs are dangerous. Beliefs are like those weird, crazy things that get into people's heads and make them think and do really weird stuff. And everybody today is scared and worried about being taken in. And so we believe less and less today. And we believe in things less and less. In fact, if I were to ask you the question, what do you believe in? What do you believe in? Not only might you have difficulty answering the question at all, but the question itself probably sounds strange to you. Like nobody asks that anymore. Nobody goes around asking each other what they believe in anymore. The question feels old and outdated and irrelevant. And so we have trouble believing things today, and we especially have trouble believing in ultimate claims. Like claims, I don't know, that a man got back up from the grave, that Jesus of Nazareth is raised from the dead. This is an ultimate claim that requires belief, because if Jesus of Nazareth is raised from the dead, then you one day are going to also be raised from the dead. Then death is not the end. If Jesus of Nazareth is raised from the dead, then those loved ones that we had to say goodbye to, maybe some of them too soon, we're going to see those people again. If Jesus of Nazareth is raised from the dead, then this world of pain and evil and unrighteousness is passing away. And one day, a world of peace and life and joy is going to come in. If Jesus of Nazareth is raised from the dead, then frankly, nothing else really matters. I mean, it kind of does. I'm not saying things don't matter, but they don't matter in the way that we thought they did. Because in the light of the reality that one dude got back up from the grave, the meaning of everything else is changed. You should believe this. You should honestly, actually believe that Jesus of Nazareth bodily rose from the dead, but belief today, and in your life and in my life, is in short supply. What does it mean to believe that Jesus is risen from the dead? How can we in today's world believe, honestly, that a man got back up from the ground? Why should I believe that Jesus of Nazareth right now is alive and well? These are the questions we're going to be asking today. I've titled this Easter sermon, Some Things Must Be Believed in Order to Be Seen. Our text today is going to be John chapter 20, verses 24 to 29. After preparing this sermon, I realized that that was also my Easter text last year. But I took it in a very different zombie-related direction last year, which some of you I've learned remember, which I'm glad for. And this one will be different. So you're going to have two very different Doubting Thomas sermons in your bank. One is about zombies, and one is about this. Again, our text is John chapter 20, verses 24 to 29. This is what the text says. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Belief is difficult for us today. We find belief difficult and challenging. We're skeptical, we're suspicious, we live in the influence and the broad waters of a modern epistemology that doesn't rely and views with suspicion supernatural explanations, and so beliefs are challenging. And also just, frankly, we just feel like we don't have use for the way that the supernatural functioned in the lives of those ancient people back there. We don't need, in order to explain the weather. We don't think God's throwing lightning bolts with a divine hand down from the clouds. We just don't need those explanations that the ancient people needed way back there. And so we find belief very difficult today. The thing that we're less aware of when we have that thought and we think it's so full of the uniqueness of our modern experience is that people in the Bible found belief very difficult in their day as well. People in the Bible had a very difficult time believing. It's actually all over the Bible. The text today, the first few verses. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them. They said, hey, we've seen Jesus. He's back from the dead. He said, please. Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails and place my finger in the mark of the nails and place my hand in the side, I will never believe. Church tradition calls Thomas the twin Doubting Thomas, as though he should be particularly shamed over 2,000 years for not believing it when his buddies showed up and say, we saw a dead guy walking around. Come on. The resurrection is a weird and a strange claim that even Christians, for all the crazy things we believe, don't think that we would just believe that on any given day. The fact that Christians think that Jesus is raised from the dead doesn't mean that I'm going to believe it if someone else says, hey, I saw a dead body walking around tomorrow. It doesn't open the floodgates for me just seeing dead people walking around everywhere. This isn't like a Haley Joel Osment situation. Thomas has a very reasonable and understandable doubt. It's a very weird and strange claim to say that someone got back up from the dead, and so, he thinks that dead people generally stay dead, and so he has doubts. He says, unless I see this, I'm not going to believe. Not only does he say, I need to see it to believe it, he says, I need to get the full gamut of empirical evidence to believe it. I need to touch him. I need to see him and to know that I'm not being deceived. My hands have got to get into his wounds, in his hands and in his sides. I need the full range of empirical experience in order to believe this. And in this, Thomas is not unlike us at all. You would do basically the same thing if someone showed up to you and said, hey, so-and-so is raised from the dead. He would say, yeah, I will believe it when I see it. Right? You would do and believe and think the exact same thing. Most of the Bible is actually like this. We think of the Bible as full of, frankly, these stupid ancients who just believed any old thing. But in the Old Testament, when God's people are fleeing Egypt through the Exodus, and they're running away from an army, and they hit the edge of a body of water, they don't go, I bet God's going to magically ferry us over this body of water. They go, we're trapped, we're going to die. We can't cross this body of water, and an army's coming to get us. And just a little bit later, when they're wandering through a desert and they have no food or water, they don't go, we're going to be fine wandering through a desert because God will magically provide, because I believe in all this supernatural stuff. They go, you know what happens to people when they get lost wandering in a desert? They die. They die from heat and starvation and lack of water. And so they go, again, we're going to die. And a couple hundred years later, when a man is chatting with his fiance, and they're going to get married, and his fiance says, hey, by the way, great news, I'm pregnant, and God did it. He says, the wedding's off. We're not getting married anymore. And when a group of Thomas's friends come to him and say, hey, you know that guy who we really liked, who we just spent the last 3 years with, and that really horrible thing that just happened to him? Guess what? He's alive. Thomas goes, guys, come on. This is wishful thinking. There's absolutely no way. This is actually what the Bible is like. In the Bible, belief is just as difficult for people as it is today. And so we are actually very much like the people in the Bible when we generally say, I'm going to believe it when I see it. When I see it, I will believe it. And maybe you're saying that in your life about maybe a whole gamut of things, but maybe things specifically in relationship to God. Maybe in relationship to the resurrection of Jesus, or maybe even just simple things. Promises of God that are in the Scripture. Things that you're supposed to be able to get in your life from or through believing in God. We say, I just don't know about all the supernatural stuff today. I'm going to believe it when I see it. God, just show me. It really isn't that hard for you. Is it, God, to just show me? Just show me and I'll believe it. Belief is difficult for us, but we would believe if we could see. Everyone wants the experience of Thomas. We would believe if we could just have if God would just give me an experience like the one that he gave to doubting Thomas. And Thomas, again, he wants the full empirical show. The text says, 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus, poof, he's somehow there. Not sure how, but he is. And he says, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Put out your hand and place it on my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. We want God to do something like this for us. Something that we can see that's incontrovertible, where we go, God, if you would just do that for me, I would believe. This is what we want. If God would do something like this, we would believe. Now, side note, I'm not going to go all the way down this road, but if you believe that the Gospels are reliable historical documents, then you actually have access to Thomas's experience. You maybe don't have access to your own experience of God of incontrovertible proof, but if you believe that the Gospels are reliable documents that mediate what actually happened, then you actually do have, through reliable written testimony that has been authoritatively and reliably passed down through time, to Thomas's experience of the resurrected body of Jesus. And actually, if we were to go all the way down this road, you have great reason to think that the Gospels are reliable testimony. But, that aside, look what happens to Thomas when he gets this experience. He immediately says, my Lord and my God. He doesn't just see Jesus as Lord, which he maybe has already seen him as. He sees him now as one step further, my God. And he confesses the divinity of Jesus. And we think, if that's what that did for Thomas, what might it do for me? And so we're just sort of stuck here. We're stuck here in this moment of saying, God, if you would show me in an incontrovertible way, I would believe. And maybe there's like an active form of this and a passive form of this. In an active form, maybe some of us, even in our faith lives right now, have sort of, we don't have so much of a living faith. We have kind of a dead, dogmatic confession. And we're sort of waiting around for God to do something for us in order for that to liven back up again into a living faith. And so we're sort of going, God, I'm asking you to do something for me that would show me again that you're real. Maybe there's a more passive version of this where we're sort of functionally agnostic and we're kind of leaning back and we're like, you know what, if there's a being named God who has all the powers that everyone says that God does, God can show himself to me in a clear way whenever he wants to. And maybe that's where you are. Maybe you're in one of these active or passive forms of Thomas's position of just sitting there and waiting and saying, God's going to have to show me in an incontrovertible way. And if that's where you are today, in your life, in your faith life, in your lack of faith life, of course, the story of doubting Thomas is at least a story of God's grace, if that's where you are. If that's where you are today, of course, the story is at least a story of God being gracious and Jesus being gracious to people who are in that place. But if it is a story of affirming the validity of that experience, it also is a story of challenging that experience. Because Jesus himself challenges Thomas's perspective in this regard. While he, on the one hand, accommodates himself to Thomas's ask, he also seems to suggest that what Thomas is asking for is actually not ideal, and that is not actually faith, and somehow erodes the validity of his relationship with Jesus through faith in the first place. We want what Thomas got, but for some reason, Jesus doesn't seem to want for us what Thomas got. We want what Thomas got, but Jesus, for some reason, doesn't want for us what Thomas got. In response to this whole situation, this is what Jesus says to Thomas in John 20:29. Jesus said to him, did you believe because you saw me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. When Jesus here says blessed, it's the same word that's used for all the blesseds of the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus names all these people who are getting it right already, and he says, blessed are the, insert people who are getting it right here, the poor in financially, the poor in spirit, the peacemakers. Blessed are all these people who in this crazy category are getting it right. And he says they're blessed, and he calls them blessed because they're getting it right now while nobody else is. Jesus used that same word here. In other words, he's saying, people who have believed me without seeing me are blessed. They are blessed in that they're getting it right now. People are, for some reason, meant to be, ideally, believing in Jesus without seeing him. And as they're doing that in the way that it's meant to be done. This insight matches Jesus' credulity at the beginning of verse 29 when he says, did you believe me because you saw me? It's almost like he's saying, that's not really belief, Thomas. Believing me because you saw me is like, you're kind of all the way there. There's no room for faith anymore. Why would Jesus say this? Why would Jesus think that he wouldn't just want to do for everyone what he did for Thomas? Why does he actually say that it is right and good and the lived reality of blessing to actually truly believe, which means believing now without seeing the resurrected Christ? I think it is because there are some things, there are some realities, there are some good things in this world and in this life. Actually, they're all of life's best things. They're spiritual things, and they are only accessible through faith. They can't be accessed in any other way. They're not seeing as believing. They must be believed in order to be seen at all. It is true that there are some things in life for which seeing is believing. They're often life's most mundane and unimportant things, like, will my new robot vacuum successfully clean my house? I'll believe it when I see it. Or, will my kid finally clean up their room this time? I'll believe it when I see it. But for life's most important things, seeing is not believing. It is exactly the other way around. We believe first, and then we have the opportunity to see it. Believing makes us able to see them. We think that seeing is believing, but in all of life's most important things, we actually believe first so that we can see the good thing. I want to give you 3 examples of how this is true. Winning in an athletic competition, a marriage, and coming into a relationship with the truth before everybody else. These are 3 instances from our lives where you believe first so that you can see. For example, in a high-stakes athletic competition, I'm not talking here about our mediocre jogging routines. I'm not talking about that rec league that you maybe go to here sometime, whatever. I'm talking about people who are giving their all, right, on the field of play to win. Those people step on the field of play because they believe that they can win. If they don't believe that they can win, they don't step on the field of play. It is a prerequisite to step onto the field of play that makes the possibility of winning possible at all in the first place. That is my belief that I can win. You believe first so that you can then step onto the field of play and see the win come to pass. There is no other way to see the win come to pass. You believe first that it's possible, and then it is revealed to you. Your faith is vindicated when you win. Take a marriage. You believe that your spouse loves you and will be faithful to you, and you believe it first, and then, God willing, we see it proved and vindicated to be true over time. We don't get all the data first. We don't see all the data first and then enter into the marriage. There's no way to, even if there were a way to do that, to like think into the future and look at the whole thing and say, is this person going to be faithful to me? Will they love me all the time? Armed with that knowledge, you would actually have something with you going into the marriage that shatters some of the best things about what a marriage is. Because it's not loving someone when you know with predictive certainty how everything's going to go. Love has risk and contingency and free agents full of free will. And so actually to have all that information would actually ruin right at the start the best things about what a marriage can be. You believe first that this person and I love one another and that we'll be faithful to one another over time. And then God willing, that faith is vindicated and you see it happen over time. You believe first and then you see. A third example comes from the story I used in the introduction. The ability to come into the relationship with the truth before everybody else. How did Elizabeth know? What did she get? I don't know exactly what she got. When she met Anthony and read the documents and read the story, reading state documents that would have said our best forensic evidence at the time links this man to the scene. It proves later that that was incorrect, but the best evidence at the time said this man was there. And somehow she looked at all of that and believed his story over what looks like the best available evidence, and she was right before everybody else. And let's just be clear, there was a huge cost that man paid in his life because other people would not believe him in spite of the evidence and come into a relationship with the truth sooner. You know, in reality, even the basic process of human knowing works this way. All human empirical or scientific endeavor relies at some point on belief and believing in order to see or keep seeing. This is going to get a little technical for just a second. If you don't care, I don't know, take a minute nap. But for those of you who do care, I hope that this speaks to you and your epistemological and empirical questions. At some point in all human empirical knowing, we have to believe in order to keep seeing what we're seeing with our senses. And you may, not believe me. You may be like, I don't know, that sounds like a weird, crazy thing that pastors say, but it's probably not true. So if you don't believe me, I'm hoping that you'll believe Bertrand Russell, the eminent British philosopher and atheist, who writes about this in his book, The History of Western Philosophy. And in his chapter on David Hume was a famous Scottish philosopher and skepticist who taught a philosophy of skepticism, which said we really can't know anything for sure and for certain. And the reason why David Hume thought that is because he thought, bear with me, that the principle of induction as it applies to causation could not actually be trusted. This is what that means. The principle of induction with respect to causation. It means this, that when I observe something and A happens, and that when A happens, B happens, and I observe it one time. And then I observe it a second time, and when A happens, B happens. And then a third time, when A, B. Fourth time, 100 times, A happens, B happens. Then what we want to be able to say is that the 101st time, when I'm not looking at it, when A happens, B will happen anyways. And David Hume tore that principle to the ground and said there's no way that you can actually get to that principle through empirical method or through sheer reason. You just jump into the principle. You believe into it. Once you believe it, it's vindicated. It looks like it's true. But you can't observe things enough times to know that the next time it's not going to happen a different way. This is what Bertrand Russell says in his conclusion on what Hume says about this. He says this: if this principle of induction with respect to causation is not true, every attempt to arrive at general scientific laws from particular observations is fallacious. And Hume's skepticism is inescapable for an empiricist. To this extent, Hume has proved that pure empiricism is not a sufficient basis for science. But if this one, such a key phrase, if this one principle is admitted, could I suggest believed? If this one principle is admitted, everything else can proceed in accordance with the theory that all our knowledge is based on experience. It must be granted, he says, that this is a serious departure from pure empiricism, and that those who are not empiricists may ask why, if one departure is allowed, others are to be forbidden. What these arguments prove, and I do not think the proof can be controverted, is that induction is an independent logical principle incapable of being inferred either from experience or from other logical principles, and that without this principle, science is impossible. At some point, even the most basic movements in human observation and knowledge gathering about the natural world needs belief to either get off the ground or needs belief to keep seeing the thing that you saw when you can't observe it anymore. All of human knowing works this way, and specific things in life that are good work this way for sure. Now, if you are thinking this through with me, you might have two skeptical observations. You might have two caveats that you want to bring back at me. You might say, Adam, I hear you about the winning athletics thing, but that's the whole point about athletics. Not everybody wins. Well, of course. Of course not everybody wins. That's not the point. Somebody will win, and their faith will have gotten them into the field of play, and it will have been vindicated. That doesn't mean that faith is a ridiculous thing to do or to choose in the right context. The question is just, what are the odds that my faith is going to be vindicated in this situation? And yes, in an athletic context, one person, their faith is not going to be vindicated. That's the nature of the competition. Some of you might say, okay, Adam, I'm hearing what you're saying about faith, but come on, this is really about confirmation bias. You believe something and you really want it to be true. You only believe in things that you really wish to be true, that you want to be true. And the power of your wanting it so badly just leads you to say, okay, it's just wishful thinking, away we go. Again, the answer is yes. A potential weakness of faith as an epistemological method is confirmation bias. Like when you enter into a marriage and you are maybe going to be clouded by all kinds of confirmation bias as you're in a relationship with this person. That doesn't mean that faith should be thrown out and not used in its appropriate circumstances. It just means that you need to be careful about whether or not confirmation bias is happening in this particular instance of belief. And if confirmation bias is a weakness in the epistemological method of faith, maybe not coming into relationship with the truth at all is a weakness of leaning back with a hyper-skeptical posture. The questions to ask are simply this. This thing that I am considering believing in, is it something that requires faith? And do I have good reason to employ the epistemological method of faith in this particular situation? These are the questions to be asked. And once you've asked these questions and weighed them clearly, if they call forth a response of faith, then my God, you should believe. And you should exercise faith. And I am telling you today that these questions, when asked of the resurrection of Jesus, call forth a reasonable response of faith, and you should believe that that guy got up from the ground. You should believe that Jesus is risen from the dead. Does the resurrection of Jesus require faith? Of course it does. It's an utterly unique event that we don't expect to see replicated in the natural world just any old time. Of course it will require faith to access. Not only that, however, but what God is trying to accomplish in our lives through the resurrection is much more like a marriage than it is like the dead ascent of a fact in an encyclopedia. And so faith gives us access to those sorts of good things. Is it reasonable to employ faith in this particular context, you might ask? Yes. The answer here, obviously, and you can do your own investigation on this, is yes. There are 3 historical facts about what the heck happened to Jesus after he died that make belief in the resurrection eminently reasonable. These are the 3 things. First, history is not able to produce the body of Jesus. It's not able. Where is his body? Where is it? And why wasn't it able to be produced? Days, weeks after Jesus died, his followers started running around telling people that he was raised from the dead. It wasn't like they started doing it 50 years later, 100 years later. It was days later. They started running around and saying, hey, that guy who we just all saw die, he's alive again. Why didn't the religious authorities of the Romans produce his body? There's no even shred of historical evidence that anyone even tried to produce his body because they couldn't find it. His body wasn't to be found. That is the first piece of historical evidence. History is unable to produce the body of Jesus. The second piece of historical evidence is that Jesus' disciples absolutely believed that they had seen the resurrected Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean that they actually saw it. This data point gives us a slightly different piece of evidence. It simply means that they were sure that they had, which means that we can know that they're not liars. All of Jesus' disciples died painful, torturous deaths over the claim that Jesus' body had been resurrected. People will die for something that is false, but they won't die for something that they know to be false. When someone knows that it's a lie, they wouldn't die for it. And so we know that Jesus' disciples didn't steal his body and shuffle it away somewhere or dump it into a lake or tear it up and feed it to animals like some people have suggested, because they all died painful, torturous deaths for the claim that he had been risen from the dead. It is historical fact. Jesus' disciples believed that they had seen him resurrected. The third historical fact about the resurrection is that before Jesus died, he told people that they wouldn't be able to find his body. Before Jesus died, he said, in 3 days, I'm not going to be there anymore. He was crucified for 2 claims. One, for claiming that I'm God's son, and second, for saying that I'm going to destroy the temple and raise it back up in 3 days. Jesus was crucified for those blasphemous statements, one of which specifically lets us know that he thought something weird was going to happen with his body in about 72 hours. Those are the 3 historical facts. Nobody can produce Jesus' body, and there's no good explanations for where it could have gone. Jesus' disciples for sure believed that they had saw him risen from the dead, And Jesus himself said, something strange is going to happen with my body in a few days. Once you have those things and you see the claim of the resurrection of Jesus, that it calls forth faith in response to something reasonable, you should look at those things and say, that is a claim where it is right to respond in faith and say, yes, Jesus of Nazareth has been risen from the dead. You should believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead. This claim calls for faith. It calls forth faith, and only faithful will do in response. And with respect to what you can investigate about this claim, it is as reasonable of a thing to believe in as they come. Now, it isn't that Thomas can't see Jesus because he won't truly believe in him. If we should believe in Jesus, why is it that Jesus wants us to actually come into a relationship with him through believing and not just through seeing? What is the good thing that Jesus specifically wants to be able to show you through faith in him? Right? If there are some things that we believe first in order to see, what is it, aside from his own resurrected reality, that Jesus wants you to be able to see by believing in him? Jesus says, if you believe in me, you're blessed. You're getting it right now. What is the blessing that you begin to perceive when you see Jesus by faith having been resurrected? And I think the answer here is me. I think that when you believe that Jesus is raised from the dead, the thing that you end up actually seeing along the way is your own resurrection. Some spiritual significance about that. Lights, come on. When Thomas gets his grand empirical moment with Jesus, he sees Jesus' resurrected body. But does he see that everything else is now resurrected too? Or does his sight just limit him to the evidence gathering about this one body? I think this is the deal. When you see by faith that Jesus is raised from the dead, your faith then clicks on everything else. You see that everything else is raised from the dead. That I am alive, I'm raised from the dead, that this whole world is going to be renewed and raised from the dead. Everything else begins to come into vision because Jesus is just the beginning of everything that is going to be raised from the dead. That is what we see when we come to Jesus by faith and believe in him. It reveals to us not just the reality of Jesus' resurrection, but the fact that I am alive in my own life. That I'm not done, that God's not done with me, that my failures haven't overwhelmed me, that there's new life and good things still coming for me. This is what John, the author of this gospel, says just a few verses later when he says why he wrote the whole gospel. He says, I wrote this whole book so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That by believing you might live, that you might see your life come into view. That believing that Jesus has risen from the dead helps you to see that I am alive and that my life is just beginning. This is what we see when we believe that Jesus is resurrected. It's what's revealed to us, ourselves, who I actually am and who God made me to be. In all of life's unimportant things, seeing is believing. But in the things that really matter, we believe first, and then it reveals to us all the things that we see as a result. And when we believe in the resurrected Christ, we see that we are living. We see that we are alive. This isn't some weird religious epistemological cop-out. It's by design. It's how faith works. And you should believe that Jesus is alive today, and as a result, that you are too. When we do, everything else comes into view. Because when the light of the resurrection begins to shine on everything, we see that everything is being purposed for life in the great purposes of God. And the things that we see now will be vindicated in the future on a great day. And then we will, with new eyes, see ourselves, the body of the resurrected Christ. But Jesus, even then, will still say to us, blessed are those who did not see me, but who believed. Amen. At Vineyard Manhattan, we love to pray for people. And so today on this Easter Sunday,